Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wait 15 years just to buy a car, or to drive a vehicle that was essentially unchanged for 3 decades? Well, welcome to the fascinating world of Soviet automotive engineering, where politics, practicality, and pure determination collided to create some of the most unique vehicles ever made. These weren't just cars, they were symbols of an entire ideology, rolling testaments to a system that prioritized collective needs over individual desires. Today, we're counting down the top 10 communist cars from the Soviet era. And trust me, some of these will absolutely blow your mind. From luxury limousines reserved for party elites to tiny city cars that became cultural icons, we're about to take a wild ride through automotive history where car ownership was a privilege, not a right. So buckle up and hit like button. Number 10. Moskvitch 412. The Moskvitch 412 might not look like much today, but in 1967, this boxy sedan represented the height of Soviet middle-class aspiration. Except with a waiting list that could stretch for years, the 412 was actually a clever piece of engineering for its time. It borrowed heavily from the Opel Kadett design, which the Soviets acquired as war reparations, but they made it distinctly their own. The car featured a 1.5-liter engine that produced about 75 horsepower. Not exactly thrilling, but remember, this was never about speed. It was about reliability in extreme conditions. What made the 412 special was its surprising durability. These cars were built like tanks, with thick steel bodies that could withstand the brutal Russian winters and the equally brutal Russian roads. Owners would often drive them for 20 or 30 years, passing them down through generations like family heirlooms. The interior was Spartan by Western standards. No air conditioning, no power windows, no fancy electronics, just a heater that worked overtime, a radio if you were lucky, and seats that felt like they were stuffed with concrete. But here's the thing, it all worked. And it kept working. The 412 became a symbol of Soviet achievement for ordinary citizens. Owning one meant you'd made it to a certain level in society. You weren't party elite, but you weren't struggling either. It was the car of engineers, teachers, and mid-level bureaucrats. Between 1967 and 1976, they built nearly 500,000 of these. That might not sound like much compared to Western production, but in the Soviet system, where private car ownership was restricted, it was massive. Many survived well into the 90s and beyond. You can still spot them on Russian roads today, usually belching smoke, but somehow still running. That's Soviet engineering for you. Not pretty, not fast, but absolutely indestructible. Number 9. ZAZ 452. If the Moskvitch was the Soviet suburban dream, the ZAZ 452 was its rugged country cousin. This military-derived off-roader first rolled off the production line in 1965, and it looked like someone had drawn a Jeep from memory using only a ruler. But appearances can be deceiving. This boxy beast could go absolutely anywhere. The 452 started life as a military vehicle, and it showed. Everything about it screamed function over form. The body panels were flat for easy repair. The engine was simple enough that a farmer could fix it with basic tools. The suspension was designed to handle everything from Siberian permafrost to Central Asian deserts. What's remarkable is how little it changed over its production run. The basic design remained virtually identical for over 50 years. The 452 was notorious for being uncomfortable, loud, and thirsty. Driving one was like being inside a metal drum during a hailstorm. But comfort wasn't the point. This was a vehicle designed to get Soviet citizens to places where roads were just a suggestion. Collective farms loved them. Geologists swore by them. Even the medical service used them as ambulances in remote areas. The 452 developed a cult following that extends far beyond the former Soviet Union. Adventure tourists seek them out specifically because they're virtually indestructible. There's a saying among ZAZ enthusiasts, you can't break it, but if you do, you can fix it with a hammer. Most came with a 2.4-liter four-cylinder that produced about 75 horsepower. Not much, but when you've got low-range gearing and locking differentials, you don't need much. Even today, ZAZ still produces an updated version of the 452. It's got a few more creature comforts now, but the basic formula remains unchanged. It's still boxy, still tough, and still capable of going places that would make a Land Rover cry. In many ways, the ZAZ 452 represents everything about Soviet automotive philosophy. Build it simple, build it strong, and make it last forever. Number 8. ZAZ 2101. Just saying the name brings a smile to anyone who lived through the 70s and 80s. The ZAZ 2101, better known simply as the Lada in export markets, was the Soviet Union's most successful attempt at creating a people's car. And by successful, I mean they built millions of them and sold them all over the world. much to the amusement of Western car enthusiasts. The story begins in 1970 when the Soviets struck a deal with Fiat. They wanted to build a modern car for the masses, and the Italians had just the thing, the Fiat 124. But in typical Soviet fashion, they didn't just copy it, they improved it. Well, they made it tougher anyway. The Lada was built to survive Russian conditions, which meant beefing up everything. Thicker steel, stronger suspension, bigger battery, more ground clearance. The result was a car that was heavier and slower than its Italian cousin, but could shrug off punishment that would destroy a Fiat. The engine was a 1.2-liter unit that made about 60 horsepower. Not exactly neck-snapping performance, but it was reliable. More importantly, it was simple. Soviet mechanics could keep these things running with string and good intentions. What made the Lada special was its export success. This was one of the few Soviet products that regular Western consumers actually bought with their own money. In Britain, it became something of a joke. What do you call a Lada with a sunroof? A skip. But here's the thing. While everyone was laughing, Lada was selling cars. Lots of them. By the late 70s, they were shifting over 100,000 units annually in Western Europe. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a Soviet car. Vinyl everywhere, a dashboard that looked like it was designed by someone who'd never seen a car before, and a heating system that was either off or surface of the sun hot. But it all worked. And more importantly, when it broke, you could fix it yourself. The Lada became a cultural phenomenon. In the Soviet Union, it represented accessible mobility. In the West, it was the butt of countless jokes. But these things were everywhere, and many still are. Number 7, RAF 2203. Now, here's something different. While most Soviet vehicles were about basic transportation or rugged utility, the RAF 2203 was designed for comfort. Well, Soviet comfort, which meant you got windows and seats that weren't made of wood. This was the USSR's take on the minibus, and it became an icon of Soviet public transportation. Built in Latvia from 1976 onwards, the RAF 2203 was everywhere in the Soviet Union. They served as route taxis, ambulances, police vans, and even hearses. If you needed to move a dozen people from point A to point B, this was your ride. The design was unique. It looked like someone had taken a regular van and sat on it, creating this distinctive low-profile shape that was instantly recognizable. Power came from a 2.4-liter engine borrowed from the Volga, producing about 95 horsepower. Not much for a vehicle this size, but Soviet roads didn't exactly encourage speed anyway. The suspension was soft, designed to cushion passengers from the worst road conditions. Riding in a RAF was like being on a boat in choppy seas. What made the RAF special was its versatility. The basic platform could be configured dozens of ways. The ambulance version had space for stretchers and medical equipment. The route taxi version crammed in as many seats as physically possible. There was even a mobile television studio variant. The RAF 2203 became such a part of Soviet life that it appeared in countless films and TV shows. It was the vehicle that took kids to pioneer camps, workers to factories, and families to funerals. Everyone had memories associated with these distinctive yellow buses. Production continued until 1997, with over 200,000 built. Many are still in service today, particularly in rural areas where their reliability and simplicity are still valued. Number 6. EASE 2125 Combi was the Soviet answer to a question nobody really asked: what if we made a Moskvitch into a hatchback? But despite its awkward origins, this peculiar little car carved out its own niche in Soviet society and became surprisingly popular with a specific type of buyer. Based on the Moskvitch 412 platform, the Combi appeared in 1973 with styling that was, well, distinctive. The rear end looked like someone had grafted a greenhouse onto a sedan. The proportions were all wrong, but somehow it worked. What the Combi lacked in beauty, it made up for in practicality. This was one of the few Soviet cars that actually considered cargo space as a priority. The mechanical bits were pure Moskvitch, which meant a 1.5-liter engine producing about 75 horsepower. But the Combi was heavier than the sedan, so performance was even more leisurely. 0 to 60? Sure, if you had all day in a tailwind. But here's where it gets interesting. The Combi developed a following among the Soviet creative class. Artists, musicians, and intellectuals loved these things. They were different, practical, and slightly rebellious. The interior was typical Soviet austere. But the Combi had one party trick: visibility. Those huge windows meant you could actually see out of the thing. In a country where most cars had gun-slit windows, this was luxury. The greenhouse effect in summer was brutal, but you could see the countryside while you slowly roasted. About 200,000 were built over its run, but the Combi's influence was larger than its sales suggest. It proved that Soviet buyers wanted choice, that not everyone was satisfied with identical sedans. Today, among collectors of Soviet cars, they're prized for their quirky character and surprising practicality. Number 5. Volga GAZ 24. If Soviet cars were a hierarchy, the Volga GAZ 24 sat comfortably in the middle upper class. This wasn't a car for ordinary workers. This was for people who mattered. Not enough to rate a Chaika, but definitely above the Moskvitch driving masses. When it launched in 1970, the GAZ 24 represented the pinnacle of Soviet automotive ambition for the professional class. The Volga was big, solid, and imposing. It had presence. The styling was conservative but dignified. It wasn't flashy. Nothing in the Soviet Union was supposed to be flashy, but it commanded respect. This was the car of factory directors, regional party officials, and successful scientists. Under the hood sat a 2.4-liter four-cylinder engine producing 95 horsepower. Not impressive by Western standards, but the Volga wasn't about performance. It was about status and durability. These engines were understressed and overbuilt, capable of running for hundreds of thousands of kilometers with basic maintenance. The interior was where the Volga really shone. By Soviet standards, it was luxurious. Real cloth seats instead of vinyl, a heater that could actually warm the cabin, a radio as standard equipment, even a cigarette lighter. For many Soviet citizens, riding in a Volga was their first taste of automotive comfort. But the Volga's real claim to fame was its role in Soviet society. These were the black cars that government officials rode in. They were the taxis in every major city. They were the police cars in Soviet action films. The KGB loved them too. They modified GAZ 24s with powerful V8 engines for high-speed pursuits. The regular version might have been slow, but the KGB specials were anything but. Over 600,000 were built before production ended in 1985. For many in the former Soviet Union, the GAZ 24 remains the definitive Soviet car. Not the most common, not the most exclusive, but the one that best represented the system's ideals. Number 4. Trabant P601. Wait, the Trabant wasn't technically Soviet, it was East German. But in the communist automotive world, the Trabant P601 deserves a place on this list. This smoking, sputtering symbol of socialist motoring became the most infamous car to ever emerge from behind the Iron Curtain. The Trabant was a car built from desperation, ingenuity, and whatever materials happened to be available. The body wasn't made of steel, too expensive. Instead, they used Duroplast, a sort of plastic made from cotton waste and resin. Yes, the Trabant was essentially made from recycled cotton. The engine was even more remarkable. A two-stroke 600cc unit that produced a whopping 26 horsepower. It sounded like an angry chainsaw and produced more smoke than a factory. You had to add oil to the fuel like a lawnmower. But here's the amazing part. It worked. The Trabant was actually brilliant in its simplicity. That plastic body, it didn't rust. The two-stroke engine, so simple that anyone could fix it. The basic design, unchanged for nearly 30 years. Performance was glacial. 0 to 60 took 36 seconds. Top speed was barely 62 miles per hour. The brakes were more of a suggestion than a command. But none of that mattered to the 16-year waiting list. East Germans would put their newborn children on the list for a Trabant, hoping that by the time they reached driving age, their number might come up. The car became a symbol of both communist inefficiency and human resilience. People decorated them, modified them, cherished them. When the Berlin Wall fell, thousands of Trabants poured into West Germany, their distinctive two-stroke smoke announcing the arrival of freedom. Western Germans were horrified and amused in equal measure. Today, the Trabant is a beloved icon. Museums display them. Tourists rent them. Collectors restore them. This terrible, wonderful little car became a symbol of making do, of finding joy in simplicity, of human ingenuity triumphing over circumstances. Number 3. GAZ M20 Pobeda. The GAZ M20, known as the Pobeda or Victory, was the Soviet Union's first truly original post-war car design. When it appeared in 1946, just 1 year after the war ended, it looked like nothing else on Soviet roads. The Pobeda was revolutionary for its time. It featured unibody construction, independent front suspension, and styling that wouldn't have looked out of place in Detroit. This wasn't just transportation. This was a statement. The Soviet Union could design and build modern cars that could compete with anything from the West. The styling was the work of Soviet designer Benjamin Samoilov, who created something genuinely beautiful. The Pobeda had flowing lines, integrated fenders, and a fastback rear that looked sporty and modern. In an era when most cars still looked like boxes on wheels, the Pobeda was sculpture. Under that shapely body was a 2.1-liter four-cylinder engine producing 50 horsepower. Not much, but the Pobeda was aerodynamic, so it could reach 70 miles per hour. More importantly, it was smooth and quiet, a revelation for Soviet drivers used to agricultural levels of noise and vibration. The interior was surprisingly well appointed. The seats were comfortable with actual springs. The dashboard was painted metal, but attractively designed. There was even a heater that worked and a radio option. For 1946, in a country still rebuilding from devastating war, this was remarkable. But the Pobeda's real significance went beyond its specifications. This was the car that proved the Soviet Union could create, not just copy. It influenced automotive design throughout the communist world. Chinese, Polish, and North Korean manufacturers all borrowed heavily from its design. Over 200,000 were built before production ended in 1958. But the Pobeda's influence lasted much longer. It established GAZ as the Soviet Union's premier automaker and showed that communist cars didn't have to be purely functional boxes. Today, restored Pobedas are highly prized. They represent a unique moment when the Soviet Union tried to build a better future. Number 2. ZAZ 965-968 Zaporohets. Oh, the Zaporozhets. If cars could have personalities, the ZAZ 965 would be the class clown. Funny-looking, not particularly talented, but somehow impossible not to love. This tiny rear-engined city car became the butt of more jokes than any other Soviet vehicle. Yet it also became one of the most beloved. The Zaporohets first appeared in 1960 as the Soviet Union's answer to cars like the Volkswagen Beetle and Fiat 600. But where those cars had charm and reliability, the ZAZ had character. Lots and lots of character. The design was, to put it kindly, unique. It looked like someone had tried to draw a car from memory after having it described over a bad phone connection. The proportions were all wrong, but that weird shape hid some clever engineering. The rear-mounted air-cooled V4 engine produced between 23 and 40 horsepower depending on the version. Not much power, but the Zaporozhets was very light. So light that strong winds could actually blow it off course. But that engine was accessible. You could literally sit on the rear bumper and work on it. The Zaporohets became famous for its quirks. The heating system would either freeze you or gas you with exhaust fumes. The handling was adventurous. The build quality was such that every car had its own unique set of rattles and squeaks. But here's the thing. People loved them anyway. The Zaporohets was affordable, even by Soviet standards. It was the car for people who couldn't afford anything better. Young families, pensioners, rural dwellers. This was their ticket to mobility. The jokes were endless. What's the difference between a Zaporohets and a cigarette? You can smoke in a cigarette. How do you double the value of a Zaporohets? Fill the tank. But behind the humor was genuine affection. These little cars represented freedom for people who had few options. Production continued until 1994 with over 3 million built. That's 3 million people who got to experience personal transportation, even if that experience involved a lot of pushing, swearing, and improvised repairs. The Zaporohets might have been the worst car the Soviets ever made, but it was also the most democratic. Number 1. ZIL 114-115. And here we are at number 1, and it could only be the ZIL. While millions of Soviet citizens waited years for a Lada, or made do with the Zaporohets, the Communist Party elite rolled in these massive hand-built limousines that made Western luxury cars look modest by comparison. The ZIL 114 and its successor, the 115, weren't just cars. They were rolling contradictions, symbols of inequality in a supposedly classless society. The ZIL 114 appeared in 1967, replacing the even more massive 111. It was modern, imposing, and unmistakably Soviet. Over 20 feet long and weighing 3 tons. This wasn't transportation, it was a statement. Everything about the ZIL was excessive. The engine was a 7-liter V8 producing 300 horsepower. In a country where most cars struggled to reach 50 horsepower, this was obscene. The interior was like a mobile Kremlin. Leather, wood, thick carpets, and enough legroom to hold a small party meeting. These weren't mass-produced. Each ZIL was hand-assembled by the best craftsmen in the Soviet Union. Panel gaps were measured in fractions of millimeters. The paint was applied in dozens of coats. In a society that preached equality, the ZIL was a rolling monument to privilege. The technology was impressive. The 114 featured power everything: windows, seats, antenna, air conditioning that could freeze a small room, a radio telephone for important calls, bulletproof glass and armor plating for the really important passengers. This was 1960s Soviet Union, where most people were lucky to have indoor plumbing. The 115, introduced in 1977, took things even further. It was even larger, even more powerful, and even more exclusive. These cars were so special that ordinary citizens weren't even allowed to buy them. They were reserved for the Politburo, visiting dignitaries, and the very highest levels of government. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a communist state dedicated to equality, producing some of the most exclusive luxury cars in the world. While workers waited a decade for a Lada, Brezhnev had a fleet of ZILs. It was everything wrong with the Soviet system, wrapped in 3 tons of steel and leather. Production numbers were tiny, just a few dozen per year. Each one was essentially custom-built. Some had bars, some had conference tables, some had beds. All had presents. When a ZIL rolled up, everyone knew someone important was inside. Today, ZILs are among the most collectible Soviet cars. They represent the pinnacle of what the USSR could achieve when cost was no object, and ideology took a backseat to luxury. They're rolling reminders of a system that preached equality while practicing something very different. The ZIL 114 and 115 weren't just the ultimate Soviet cars. They were the ultimate expression of Soviet contradictions. And there you have it. That's 10 communist cars from the Soviet era that defined transportation behind the Iron Curtain. From the humble Moskvitch to the mighty ZIL, each of these vehicles tells a story about life in a system where even choosing a car was a political act. Did any of these surprise you? Maybe your family had stories about waiting for a Lada or keeping a Trabant running with creative repairs. Drop your communist car memories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this drive through automotive history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We'll see you next time.